The twilight deepened over the gray stone walls of Odawara Castle, painting the western sky in bruised purples and fading amber. Below, the distant murmur of the village, a final lingering sigh of the day's toil, began to recede, swallowed by the encroaching shadows. A cool, crisp air, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant cooking fires, brushed against Kenshin's face, prickling the exposed skin beneath his helm. He adjusted the rough, utilitarian fabric of his new uniform, feeling its unfamiliar texture against his shoulders, a constant reminder of his elevated, yet humbling duty. His katana, a familiar weight at his hip, felt heavier tonight, each ounce imbued with the solemnity of the task ahead. Kenshin, barely a man, still with the raw edges of youth clinging to his discipline, ascended the narrow, winding steps of the north watchtower. The stone was cold, slick with a fine evening dew. At the pinnacle, an older guard, his face a landscape of weathered lines, stood like a statue carved from shadow. He offered no greeting, no unnecessary words, only a slow, deliberate turn of his head. His eyes, dark and knowing, swept over Kenshin with an almost imperceptible appraisal. Kenshin met the gaze, forcing his own youthful anxiety deep beneath a veneer of practiced calm and rigid posture. He imagined the discipline, honed through countless drills and long hours of quiet study, emanating from him, an unyielding shield against the tremor in his hands. The older samurai pointed silently towards the northeastern quadrant of the wall, a gesture that conveyed the weight of the watch, the unseen threats, and the unblinking vigilance required. Then, with a quiet metallic clink that seemed amplified in the gathering gloom, he passed a heavy, oiled lantern into Kenshin's grip. Its pale, flickering light did little to dispel the shadows, but offered a small, immediate focus in the vastness. A brief, almost imperceptible nod passed between them, a transfer of responsibility far heavier than the lantern itself. The older guard then turned, his heavy, deliberate footsteps fading quickly down the stone steps, each echo swallowed by the deepening night. Kenshin was left utterly alone, the last vestiges of daylight clinging precariously to the distant mountain peaks. A profound, absolute silence descended, broken only by the frantic beat of his own heart and the distant, rhythmic chirping of an insect hidden somewhere in the unseen world below. The absolute silence, so profound moments ago, began to reshape itself, not into noise, but into a different kind of quiet. Kenshin's ears, now hyper-aware from the departure of the older guard and the sheer weight of his solitude, started to register the subtle symphony of the castle settling into its nightly slumber. He heard the wind, a long, sighing whisper that wove through the heavy, lacquered eaves of the watchtower like an ancient, unseen spirit. Below, deep within the wooden structure, ancient timbers groaned and creaked, a slow, organic protest against the passage of time and the weight of the stone above. Far, far in the distant valley, a solitary owl's mournful call drifted up, a fragile thread of sound against the vast, dark tapestry of the night. emphasizing the profound isolation of his post. The cold, a patient, persistent adversary, began its methodical seep. Despite the layers of coarse, thick cloth beneath his simple armor, he felt it penetrating, first to the surface of his skin, then a slow, insidious chill that worked its way into his bones. His fingers, wrapped around the hilt of his katana, already felt the bite, a subtle numbness that he instinctively fought. He began to pace, a measured, almost ritualistic movement along the narrow walkway of the rampart. His footfalls were soft, deliberate, a silent defiance against the creeping stagnation. Each step was an attempt to maintain the circulation in his chilled limbs, to keep his mind sharp, his vigilance unyielding. His heightened senses absorbed every detail. The cold stone of the rampart walls was slick with a fine layer of condensation, tasting of damp earth and mineral when he unconsciously brushed it. The faint metallic scent of his lacquered armor, a faint iron tang mixed with the dark, polished wood, was a constant, almost imperceptible presence in the cold air. The dim lantern he held, its flame a captive, nervous dance, cast long, wavering shadows that stretched and shrank with every gust of wind, transforming familiar shapes into fleeting, monstrous silhouettes. A stone gargoyle seemed to grin, then frown, then melt back into the wall. A pile of coiled rope became a sleeping beast. Within the disciplined confines of his mind, a quiet monologue played out. He reminded himself of his duty, of the lineage he represented, of the countless generations of samurai who had stood exactly where he stood now. His father's stern, unwavering gaze, his master's lessons on unwavering vigilance, echoed in the silent chambers of his memory. The fear, cold and sharp, of missing something, of failing in this sacred trust, was a goad, a constant spur to his alertness. He remembered the stories of unseen infiltrators, of cunning spies, of surprise attacks launched under the cloak of deepest night. It was a fear that kept him alive, kept him awake. He lifted his gaze, searching the vast, moonless sky. He sought reassurance in the distant, indifferent stars, tiny pinpricks of light that offered neither comfort nor threat, only a stark, silent reminder of the immense, uncaring universe beyond the castle walls. As the night deepened, the familiar shapes of the castle transformed into menacing silhouettes, and every rustle of leaves became a potential threat, blurring the lines between imagination and reality. The wind, which had been a low sigh, now carried a new chorus of faint, disquieting sounds. Below the ramparts, in the unseen depths of the castle's outer grounds, dry leaves skittered, and unseen creatures rustled through the dense undergrowth. A tiny ecosystem, oblivious to the sentinel above, played out its nightly drama. Yet each snap of a twig, each scurry, became magnified in Kenshin's heightened awareness. His ears strained, dissecting every minute disturbance. Then, an insistent, rhythmic drip, drip, drip. Water, perhaps from a hidden gutter or a seep in the ancient stone, echoed with chilling regularity in the heavy air.
a slow, methodical pulse against the vast silence. It was the sound of time passing, of the night deepening, of water inexorably carving its path.
His fingers, numb from the cold, despite his efforts to keep them warm, instinctively sought the hilt of his katana. He gripped it, the smooth, lacquered shark skin, a familiar, reassuring texture beneath his gloved hand. He shifted his weight, testing the balance of the blade in its saya, feeling its dormant power. Its weight was a constant, tangible reminder of his purpose, a cold, dark promise against the unknown. His gaze swept the horizon once more, his eyes aching from the relentless strain to pierce the oppressive gloom beyond the castle walls. The moon, still hidden, offered no light, only a vast, star-dusted velvet, thick and impenetrable. A sudden sharp gust of wind tore across the rampart, rattling loose timbers and whistling through the gaps in the stonework. It brought with it a sound, fleeting and indistinct, that made Kenshin stiffen, his blood turning to ice. Was it the wind's phantom cry, a trick of the swirling air? Or was it a voice, a low, guttural whisper carried on the night's breath, too brief, too indistinct to confirm? He paused, rigid, holding his breath until his lungs ached, every muscle tensed, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He pressed himself against the rough stone of the parapet, straining to hear it again, to discern some shape or movement in the inky blackness. Nothing. Only the continuing sigh of the wind, now seeming to mock him, and the rhythmic drip of water, relentless and uncaring. The absolute isolation of his post became a palpable weight, pressing in on him from all sides. He was a lone figure, a single fragile point of vigilance against a vast, indifferent darkness. The feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes piercing the gloom, settled upon him like a shroud, even if by nothing more than the ghosts of his own apprehension, or the ancient, unblinking gaze of the night itself. For a brief, desperate moment, he longed for the sound of another human voice, a sign of shared vigilance. Then, faint and distant, barely perceptible above the wind's mournful howl, came the dull, rhythmic thud of a sandal on stone, the soft clink of distant armor. Other watchmen, far along another section of the wall, patrolling their own lonely stretches. The sound was a fleeting comfort, a brief tether to a world still populated by others. But then, it too faded, absorbed by the immensity of the night, leaving Kenshin once again in the profound, unnerving quiet. The wind continued its whisper, and Kenshin was alone with his sharpened steel, his pounding heart, and the lengthening shadows. The immensity of the night, once a source of unnerving quiet, now transformed into a suffocating blanket. The hours had begun to crawl, each moment heavier than the last, settling upon Kenshin like a damp, chilling shroud. Fatigue, relentless and insidious, began its slow siege, pulling at his eyelids, blurring the edges of his vision. His thoughts, once sharp and vigilant, now drifted, fragmenting like smoke in the cold air. A battle waged within him, not against an unseen foe, but against his own weakening resolve, against the insidious lure of sleep. He pinched the flesh of his forearm, a sharp, almost desperate attempt to anchor himself to the present, to the reality of his duty. He stamped his feet, a dull, rhythmic thud against the damp stone, then shifted his weight, rubbing the numbness from his fingers. The cold had long since seeped through the layers of his cloth and armor, chilling him to the bone, transforming his muscles into stiff, protesting cords. Every joint ached, a deep, persistent throb. The metallic tang of his lacquered armor, once a scent of duty, now mingled with the stale, faintly sour taste of cold rice, a phantom presence on his tongue from a meal eaten what felt like an eternity ago. The air grew heavier, thick with an increasing dampness that promised more than just the deep chill. From far beyond the castle walls, a new sound began to assert itself, faint at first, then growing into a soft, steady murmur, the distant, rhythmic drumming of rain. It was a sound that typically brought solace, a cleansing wash over the land, but tonight it only served to deepen the oppressive atmosphere, adding another layer of cold, a penetrative chill that sought out any exposed skin. He pulled his hood tighter, drawing the coarse fabric closer around his ears, as if to ward off not only the rain, but also the encroaching weariness. In his mind's eye, fleeting images flickered. The stern, unyielding gaze of his master during morning training, the smooth, worn texture of his mother's hand as she bid him farewell, the familiar, comforting scent of the tatami mats in his childhood home. These memories, fragments of a life beyond this desolate watch, served as thin, fragile anchors, pulling him back from the brink of mental surrender. He leaned, almost imperceptibly, against a cold, unforgiving stone pillar, the rough surface pressing against the back of his neck, a harsh reminder to remain alert. Every fiber of his being screamed for rest, for the oblivion of sleep, but the terrible consequences of failure, the dishonor, the danger to his lord and his household stood like an invisible sentinel beside him, a stark and terrifying guardian against the urge to close his eyes. His internal struggle raged, a silent, desperate battle against the insidious pull of sleep. His gaze, heavy-lidded moments before, was fixed on the impenetrable blackness beyond the castle's outer wall, where the distant, rhythmic drumming of the rain continued its mournful cadence. Then, in that deep, oppressive void, a faint, fleeting flicker of light ignited. It was barely there, a ghost of illumination, a pinprick of orange in the vast expanse of gray and black. And then, as swiftly as it had appeared, it vanished, swallowed once more by the all-consuming night. Kenshin's exhaustion, a heavy cloak draped across his entire being, evaporated in an instant, replaced by a raw, cold surge of adrenaline that prickled his scalp and sent a jolt through his weary limbs.
every muscle tensed, his breath caught in his throat, held tight. Was it merely a trick of the rain, refracting through the gloom? A lone firefly, strayed too far from its usual haunts? Or, far more terrifyingly, was it a signal? A message exchanged in the heart of the night, meant only for those who understood its silent language.
His eyes, now wide and piercing, scanned the darkness with an intensity that burned. His senses, previously dulled by fatigue, sharpened to an almost unbearable degree. The subtle shift in the wind, the distant drip of water from a hidden eave, the faint, earthy scent of wet soil carried on the breeze, all were amplified, scrutinized for any further clue. A desperate thought surfaced, to sound the alarm, to shatter the night with the urgent cry that would rouse the entire castle. But the shame of a false alarm, the scorn and disgrace that would surely follow, held his tongue, freezing the words before they could even form. It was a weight as heavy as any stone. So he stayed, absolutely still, a statue carved from anxiety and vigilance, straining to see, to hear, to feel anything more that might betray the night's secrets. The silence that settled back around him was no longer merely empty. It felt heavier, denser, now suffocatingly laden with a fresh, insidious potential menace. He slowly, deliberately reached for the hilt of his katana, his fingers closing around the worn, familiar sharkskin grip. The feel of the cold, polished steel against his thumb was a solid, undeniable comfort in the face of such profound uncertainty. His gaze swept his immediate surroundings, scrutinizing every shadow, every uneven rise of the wall. He was no longer just standing watch. He was convinced, with a chilling certainty, that he needed to be ready for anything and everything. The night had suddenly shifted, transforming from a battle against himself into a silent, perilous standoff against an unseen, unknown adversary. The incident, fleeting as it was, left him profoundly shaken, his mind now a frantic whirl of possibilities and perils, racing to decipher the silent threats of the deep night. As the pre-dawn deepened, pressing its chill embrace tighter around the castle, it felt as though the very stones of Odawara held their breath, awaiting the first tentative promise of day. The pre-dawn had pressed its chill embrace tighter, and the very stones of Odawara had indeed held their breath. Now, after what felt like an eternity, a faint, almost imperceptible gray wash began to stain the eastern hills. Slowly, painstakingly, the black canvas of the night receded, giving way to the first tentative promise of day. The outlines of the gnarled pines beyond the castle walls, which for hours had been menacing, formless specters, began to reassert their familiar shapes, sharpening against the brightening sky. The deep, mournful sighs of the wind through the eaves, the unsettling creaks of old timber, and the rustling whispers of unseen creatures, all the unsettling sounds that had defined the long night, began to ebb, fading into the collective memory of the darkness. In their place, a faint, tentative chirping emerged, a fragile chorus of sparrows and robins, greeting the reluctant dawn. It was a sound Kenshin had not realized he longed for, a small yet profound affirmation of life returning to the world. A deep, shuddering breath escaped his lips, a sigh he hadn't realized he had been holding for hours, a release of the immense tension that had coiled within him. His entire body ached with a dull, persistent throb. His shoulders were stiff, his legs heavy, and his eyes burned, gritty and dry from hours of straining against the gloom.
Yet, beneath the profound physical discomfort, a powerful current of relief, warm and unexpected, began to wash over him. He had endured. He had stayed. Then, from the winding path that led up to his solitary post, a new silhouette emerged from the still clinging shadows. Footsteps, crisp and rhythmic, crunched softly on the gravel, drawing nearer. It was the next sentinel, a man Kenshin recognized, though they had rarely exchanged more than a nod. As the new guard approached, his form solidifying in the growing light, he offered a quiet, almost inaudible greeting.
His eyes, though weary, held a silent acknowledgment, a shared understanding of the long, lonely night that had just passed. There was no need for words. The unspoken ritual of transfer was swift, wordless, understood between them, a silent passing of the heavy mantle of duty. Kenshin's vigil was, at last, complete. Kenshin's vigil was, at last, complete. With a profound, weary exhalation, he began his descent from the ramparts, his muscles stiff, his joints aching with the long night's cold. Each step on the worn stone path echoed softly in the pre-dawn quiet, a rhythmic cadence of duty fulfilled.
He made his way through the sleeping castle grounds, past silent wooden barracks where other retainers still dreamed, past courtyards where dew-laden gravel crunched underfoot. The air remained damp and sharply cold, though a nascent, almost imperceptible gray wash now softened the eastern sky, hinting at the first weak rays of sunlight that would soon filter through the skeletal winter trees. He moved with an ingrained efficiency, a quiet ghost in the dawning light, until he reached the modest quarters he called his own. The familiar scent of tatami mats and aged cypress wood, a comforting balm after the harsh outside air, enveloped him as he slid open the shoji screen. Inside, the dim light of a single flickering oil lamp cast long, dancing shadows, preserving the hushed reverence of the early hour. He carefully shed his outer layers, the damp, stiff uniform, the heavy lacquered armor, each piece placed with the precision of long practice. As the confining materials came away, a gradual warmth began to return to his skin, a gentle thawing from within that eased the deep chill in his bones.
His stomach rumbled, a sharp reminder of the long fast. From a small lacquered box, he took a simple bowl of cold rice, left from the evening meal, and sat cross-legged on the tatami. There was no fire for warmth, no hot tea, just this quiet, unassuming sustenance. Each grain, eaten slowly, thoughtfully, tasted of endurance and the silent satisfaction of duty performed. The memory of the long night watch, the gnawing fear,
The biting cold, the unyielding vigilance, settled within him not as a burden, but as a silent, hardening pride.
He had faced the darkness, wrestled with his own fears, and emerged unbroken. He was a sentinel. His body craved sleep, a deep, restorative oblivion. But before he allowed himself that luxury, he carefully wiped his katana, sheathing it with a soft click. A final, deliberate act of discipline. He knew the cycle of duty would soon begin anew. Perhaps another watch, perhaps training, perhaps the quiet, unseen tasks that bound a samurai to his household.